first begin, and also we're very pleasure to meet with Professor and invite you to join us and to share insights. And I want to begin like, can you please introduce with us about China's recent policies regarding to its clean energy transition and why it's a huge, valuable policy to the Beijing right now?
Well, I think that it's important to sort of have a sense of the history of how China's policy evolved. I mean, when I started working in China 30 years ago, when I talked to Chinese leaders about climate change, their attitude generally was that that's your problem. You people in the West created the problem. You have to solve it. But that's all changed, and it changed directly when China became the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, more than the United States. And from that point on, China became very concerned about becoming a leader in dealing with climate change. And I was really impressed with the agreement that was struck in 2014 between President Obama and President Xi Jinping, which led directly to the Paris Agreement and to the global focus on dealing with these things. That was a really, really important thing.
But why do you think that China or Beijing government value its like energy policy so much? Is it a competition area between with the U.S.?
No, I don't think that's the motivation. I think that the motivation was that China had obvious problems with air quality, for example, burning dirty coal. And so it got to the point where people were getting sick by breathing dirty air, and the government said, we have to do something about that. And they that's when they decided that they're going to cut down on the use of coal. And a natural transition, if you're going to go out of coal, what is going to be your energy source? And so you then start thinking about non-carbon sources of energy, and that's what happened.
You mentioned about the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
Nowadays, like recent U.S.-China trade tensions, such as tariffs on solar panels and EV components, have affected green technology supply chains. And how might these reshape China's clean energy transition right now, and also alter the pace of U.S.-owned clean energy progress?
I think that we're in a very difficult situation time-wise at the moment, particularly with the change of policy in the Trump administration on dealing with some of these issues. And so I think that the other piece of background which I think is important is to realize that the Chinese economy has slowed down. And it's slowed down in part because they had overinvested maybe in wind and solar and renewable sources of energy. And so if the market for these did not continue to grow, then that was a problem. And the other thing was, of course, the collapse of the real estate system in China was another serious problem that led to people losing their jobs, and it led to instability and concerns. And it also led to secondary effects on the economy. For example, if you're not going to be building houses and apartment buildings, then you're not going to be producing cement and iron and steel, and so that has an effect on the economy. So the entire economy in China, as far as I can see, has sort of slowed down. And so then the question is, what is the future of the Chinese economy? But at the same time, China continues to invest in wind and solar and in biomass and in hydrogen and in all the renewable energy sources in a major way. So the question is, what is the ultimate aim here? How is that going to work out? My view is that you have to begin by recognizing that climate change is a very, very serious, immediate problem for the world, not just for China, not just for the United States, the world. And what is the problem? Well, the problem is that the world is seeing extreme weather situation. In the last few days, we've seen floods in Alaska, of all places, and also serious flooding in different parts of the world. And that's affecting the ability of people to produce food, and so leading to instability and affecting the state of the world. And so how much time do we have to do that? We have very little time. We have to move away from using coal, oil, and natural gas almost immediately or as soon as possible. And we need to be able to do that in a global way. So it needs to be a coordinated activity. And that's where I'm particularly concerned about the lack of leadership in Washington in dealing with these things at the moment. I mean, the problem is that up until the beginning of this administration, the U.S. was a serious player in dealing with climate change, together with China, and President Trump doesn't believe in climate change. He believes, as he's described, it's a hoax. He also doesn't believe in renewable energy. He believes in drilling and more oil and more natural gas. Well, that's a very short-handed way of saying that we can't afford that on a global basis. That has to stop. And in the meantime, where's the leadership going to come from? I think that if I were thinking about, if I were advising the Chinese government, for example, about how you deal with the problem of unemployment and the slowdown in the economy, a real possibility is that China becomes a major exporter of wind and solar and electric vehicles and batteries and so on and so forth. So China can become, the economy of China doesn't have to depend just on what's happening domestically. It can perhaps become an export economy, as it was hoping to do in the past.
So as U.S. and China now impose new restrictions on each other's critical materials, and how should both sides balance its supply chain security with climate change commitment?
Well, I think that you know, the current situation is not particularly stable. I mean, it's a matter of the U.S. Taking some action against China, then China responding, and so we can't continue this. So, for example, China has announced that they're going to cut down on supplying rare earths to the world and to the United States in particular. I mean, that would be devastating to the global economy. And you know, the fact is that China has a major source of rare earths that are so critical for the economy. You know, if the United States were to try to build its own rare earth economy, it would take 3 years, 5 years at a minimum. And in the meantime, what's happening to the global economy? So we need to have a better agreement about what to do.
And also we know that rare earth is not that rare. Now, Pakistan has rare earths, and other countries also have rare earth materials. But China's almost the only country in the world that can have major rare earth progressing technology. So do you think that will change in the near term?
I think that what my sense of what happened here is that China made this decision to change its energy situation from coal and oil and gas to renewables, so-called renewables. And in doing that, it recognized that it had to make major investments in solar panels, and also in wind, and also in hydrogen, so-called green hydrogen, and also in rare earths that were going to be an important part of this thing. And so China sort of made an early decision to do that, and that was, as it turns out, a very important thing to do. Now, up until recently, the world has been sort of believed that trade was an international issue, and that stability in the world requires trade. The World Trade Organization is a very important part of this. But if you start breaking down those barriers and start having penalties imposed, it's not going to work very well. My sense, though, is that there's a little bit of this is China responding to what the U.S. did, and threatening to do something. And I noticed in the last few days that there's been a softening of the attitude in Washington towards this, a recognition that the U.S. and China have to work together, and so I think that's a good idea.
So we can say that you do think growing trade tensions may slow down the global energy transition?
I would hope not, but at the moment I think it's having an effect. But I would hope that it's a short-term effect. I mean, China's President Xi Jinping made some amazing commitments at the latest UN conference. Just to summarize that, he said that China was going to cut its total greenhouse gas emissions by 7 to 10% below the peak level by 2035. Mm-hmm. That's the first time that China has made a commitment to do something in absolute terms rather than relative terms. That was very important. Second thing was that Xi Jinping announced that China was going to increase its production of wind and solar power by a factor of 6 relative to 2020, and to reach a very high level of 3,600 gigawatts by 2035. Pretty important. Third thing that he said was that non-fossil fuels are going to make up more than 30% of the total energy consumption in China by 2035. Now, repeat that, more than 30%. Now, of course, more than 30% still means that there's a lot of fossil fuel being used. Simply a statement that the non-fossil fuels would be more than 30%, but then what's the other 70%? The other thing is that Xi Jinping announced that China was going to make significant continuing commitments in what he called new energy vehicles. New energy vehicles are electrically propelled buses and battery-powered cars and so on. So a major commitment to do that for new vehicle sales. The other thing that he said was that China was committed to planting trees and to growing its forest situation. That's a way of offsetting the CO2 going into the atmosphere. If you have more trees, then you're absorbing that CO2 and you're offering a solution to that. Also, this is Premier Li said something I thought was very interesting too. He announced the launch of a joint China-UN Global South-South Development Facility with an initial contribution, not very much, $10 million, but with a plan to implement 2,000 projects over 5 years in poor developing countries. That I think is really also a very important thing to do.
You mentioned about Xi Jinping's goal regarding to climate change, and we all knew that China made huge commitment in the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
And do you think, is it look well right now? Do you think China will achieve the goal ultimately?
I think that it was difficult. It was a difficult goal, and of course it was interrupted by COVID. That affected a lot of different things, and I think that what President Xi Jinping is now talking about is fairly ambitious plans for 2035, by 2035. And can he do that? Well, I think the jury's out. I mean, a critical question is, what is going to be the state of the Chinese economy? I mean, if the Chinese economy is going to tank, that means that the government was going to have less power to do these things. And so that's going to be a very important factor too. So a really important background question is, what is the future of the Chinese economy? It's not going to be real estate anymore, and it's and so can the economy be built around solar panels and wind turbines and so on? I think there's a possibility that it could be, but that has to be part of a global plan to deal with climate change.
And in recent years, China has come to see that energy self-sufficiency as a part of national security, but with global supply chains disruptions and U.S. export controls, do you think China will prioritize its energy independence over climate commitments? And do you think U.S. might face similar challenges?
Well, I think that countries are going to be increasingly concerned about energy independence. I mean, if you don't want to be in a position where you are totally dependent on somebody else to supply the energy needs. And so we saw that in the past with oil shocks, for example, where problems with Iran led to a failure to deliver oil reliably to developing countries, to countries that needed the oil. So I think that we have reached the point, excuse me, coughing. We've reached the point where I think we know that we have to depend on a level of security, and we can do that. I mean, the sun shines, the wind blows, and if you use it sensibly, you have a level of energy security.
See or access China's policy dilemma between sustaining economic growth, you just mentioned, and achieving emissions reduction right now?
Yeah, I think that it is. I think it's possible for growth to continue under this changing circumstance, but if it's going to happen, I think it has to happen with a global commitment again to dealing with climate change. And a global agreement dealing with climate change that leads to a global commitment to stopping using fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, replacing them with electricity sources that are produced from wind and solar and biomass also. And if it's done on a global basis, then there's a global market. I mean, China is already the cheapest supplier of solar panels in the world. Why is that? The reason it's the cheapest supplier is that it made a very early commitment in the government to in fact develop solar panels as a major part of the Chinese economy. And so it subsidized the development. And so as a consequence, China now has the world's cheapest solar panels. And there's a concern in parts of the world, including in the US, that that means that the US is potentially dependent on China for solar panels. And that would be something that would be of concern in terms of security.
I'm curious about how should policymakers manage this risk that climate cooperation becomes another arena of strategic competition between US and China?
Which?
The policymakers, how should they manage the risk that climate cooperations becomes another area of strategic competition?
I don't think it has to be an area of strategic competition. If I go back again to the Paris Agreement and to the arrangements that were made by President Xi Jinping and President Obama, those were not commitments to competition. They were commitments to cooperation to develop it and to develop renewable sources of energy together and to supply it as cheaply as possible to the world. And so I would like us to get back to that.
And given that clean energy innovation depends on cross-border access to materials and research, and do you think scientific cooperation can help ease the rare earth tension between the US and China?
I think that scientific competition or scientific cooperation is a very important part of where the world is going. I mean, I think that it is very important. I think in general, so long as we're not talking about scientific activities that are leading to military issues, there's no reason why science cannot serve the public good, and to do it cooperatively. And in the earlier days in the United States, for example, when President Kennedy announced that the United States was going to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, he issued in a whole development of science in the United States. And that development of science in the United States depended on importing scientists from other parts of the world, notably from Europe. And so it sort of changed the dynamics of science in the United States. Now, I think there's been good cooperation between universities here and universities in China and the Chinese government on renewable sources of energy and climate change, and I hope that will continue. I mean, here at Harvard, we have 30 years ago, we started something called the China Project on energy and environment, and the idea of doing that 30 years ago was that it was important that the two large countries should cooperate and work together. And I think on the most part, we have done that here, and I think it's very important to do that in the future. And my concern is that there's been a setback with the politics in Washington at the moment, which hopefully is temporary. And I would also temper that by saying that, the news is not all bad, or not all good, or all bad. I mean, the attitude that Trump has about climate change is not shared by everybody in the United States. And there are states in the United States that are serious about dealing with climate change. I mentioned California, I mentioned Massachusetts, I mentioned New York, northeastern states. So I think that there is hope that what's happening in Washington is a temporary hiccup, and that maybe we can get back to doing what we need to do.
And the Harvard-China project has long served, just as you said, as a model for scientific exchange. And how has the current political climate affected cross-border research cooperations?
So far, I think that we have done pretty well. We've sort of survived. I mean, we were worried that our project has a large number of Chinese visitors who come and work with us for a year or 2 years, and I usually go back to China to the government or to universities in China. And we were concerned when the Trump administration started talking about sanctions and so on. We were concerned that maybe our Chinese visitors would have problems in getting visas. And fortunately, that hasn't happened so far. We've been pretty good about getting those visas, and And I think, part of the problem maybe is that if we're dealing with issues like energy and climate, this is not a case of actually competition in the military area. And I can imagine that if a scientist from China wants to come to the United States and work on, let's say, nuclear problems, well, then there would be nervousness about that, and nervousness about that person going back to China with secrets. And hopefully that's not going to be the way it is in the future.
So right now, some in Washington view collaboration with Chinese researchers or Chinese visitors as a security risk. And what would you say to policymakers who see this kind of cooperation as some kind of zero-sum game?
I think that on the contrary, I think that to not deal with climate change is to have a security problem. So I do believe that climate change poses a global security issue for the world and for individual countries, including the United States and China. And what are the problems? Well, the problem is that if you have extreme weather that you're not able to deal with, then you lose people's homes, and people lose their lives, and agriculture is affected, so you can't feed people, and the temperature gets very hot in some parts of the world in summer, and you have a problem of people not being able to go outdoors and work, and they need more air conditioning to be able to survive. So it poses a whole series of problems that I think are important.
And given the mutual distrust between U.S. and China, what practical steps can both sides take to rebuild trust in climate and energy research? Do you both suggest?
Well, if I just talk about my personal experience with this, when we started the idea of building this China project here at Harvard, I had very good support in doing that from then Vice President Al Gore, who thought it was a very good idea. And we had a senior Chinese visitor, one of the first senior Chinese visitors to the United States in the new administration, and I invited him to come and give a public lecture here at Harvard. And when we had that conversation, he agreed to essentially become the sponsor of our project in China, and that was really, really very important. The other piece of background that was going on at the moment was that China had just formed something called the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, along CCICED. CCICED was a grandchild of the Canadian government, and what the Canadian government said was that it really is important for China to get the best advice on dealing with these issues. And a good way to do that is to form a council in which half of the members of the council are Chinese and half of the members of the council are foreign. And so that way you get a balanced view. And that the council should report to the highest level of the Chinese government both ways. It should give advice to the highest level of the Chinese government and also accept a charge to do something, to provide advice. And I was very fortunate to be invited to serve on that China Council, and I learned a lot by talking to my colleagues there and building personal relationships, and also the opportunity to talk to, we met with the presidents of China, the premiers, and we exchanging views and building friendship was a very important part of that.
And finally, looking forward, do you see climate change as one of the few remaining areas where U.S. and China can still find common ground?
No, I think that there are many places where China and the U.S. can find common ground. I think the background is to recognize that China and the U.S. are the world's two largest economies, and there's a big world that needs help to develop, and ideally China and the U.S. will cooperatively work to help developing countries make this transition. I mean, we're particularly interested more recently in. I have a recent book on India, and we're particularly interested in how do you deal with the problems of India's development, and that's a very serious issue because India is a growing economy, a rapidly growing economy. India now has the world's largest population, and India has up to now been heavily dependent on domestic sources of dirty coal. And so India also is trying to make this transition. And I think cooperation between China and India and the US can be a very important part of being able to do that. And I would also mention the fact that we should not ignore the fact that there's a big, big world of very poor people who are really at risk. Think of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where people in sub-Saharan Africa, in large parts, they don't even have electricity. They have no lights. How do people survive in this modern world? And so we have an opportunity, I think, to build a more cooperative global society, and it requires the major countries to do that, including Europe and China and the US.
I'm actually also curious about, do you think that US faced similar challenges, the pressure between economic growth within the US and also the climate change commitment, and how to deal with all this climate commitment?
Well, I think that you have to recognize that there are choices that you can make, and so you really do want to provide economic growth. That's important for people, and if you're going to provide economic growth and cut down on the use of coal, for example, in the case of the United States, you have to recognize that there are people in the United States who are dependent up to now on coal. People in West Virginia, for example, who live off coal mining. Okay, so we can't just throw them out on the street. We need to be able to help them make a transition to a different way of doing things. So I think that climate change and all the aspects that go with it, development of solar panels, new batteries, new automobiles, new buses, opportunities to use biomass, waste material in a productive way. Those are opportunities for jobs and opportunities for growth. So, for example, one of the things that we're interested in here is the idea of trying to be able to replace jet fuel in aviation with a zero carbon source. Okay, the way in which you would do that is called SAF. The way in which you could do that is by taking biomass material and turning it into a sort of zero carbon source of fuel for those planes. Okay, where do you get that carbon? Well, municipal waste is a big deal. We dump a lot of organic material in municipal dumps. And around the world, those municipal dumps are becoming more and more heavily laden. And in fact, one of the ways of dealing with waste in poor parts of the country is to just burn it. Well, if you don't have to burn it, why not just use it and find clever ways to do it? And so that provides another scientific challenge to find ways to economically be able to use that biomass productively. I was to mention also an issue in India, for example. India is a pretty poor country, and a lot of poor people live in the countryside, and they are dependent on agriculture for their livelihood. And one of the ways in which they try to survive is by planting several crops over the course of a year. So you start off with rice, then you move to wheat and so on. But as you make that transition from one crop to the other, what do you do with the waste of the first crop in the field? Traditionally, what was done in India was to burn it. And that has become an incredible pollution problem, enough to close down the capital city of Delhi for days at a time because of the air pollution. Okay, well, our thoughts are, let's find ways to use that biomass and provide jobs for the poor parts of the country, and have the biomass converted into useful products. And so that we think is an important thing to do as well.
And as a scientist, you work with so many Chinese scholars.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic that US and China can finally work together and to deal with the crucial climate issues?
I am optimistic because what I see from my experience is that despite the tensions between Beijing and Washington, it hasn't affected the relations that I have with Chinese colleagues. I mean, we have a cooperative relationship. We have friendship. It hasn't been impacted by that. I mean, our friendship is more important than this political backstop. And our hope in both cases is that This is temporary and it's going to disappear.
I think that's a wrap for our interview. Thank you for
Okay,
your time.
not at all.
Thank you so much.
Thank
For
you.
your time.
You asked good questions.
Oh, really? Thank you. I'm so nervous with talking to all those scientists.
No, you shouldn't be.
Really? Thank you so much.
Not at all.
Because I'm not an expert in climate change. But
Well, you know, you're a good reporter,
Thank
and
you so much.
that's an important thing to
It's
do.
so pleasure to speak with you and all those ideas.
And look, if you have other thoughts in the future and you want to come back, you know, I'd be delighted to talk more.
Of course, I think it's really important and valuable to deliver those ideas to all the audiences in Chinese.
Yes.
Yeah, because we're a Hong Kong-based media, and we have like 5 million audiences around the world.
Yeah.
I think people are really curious about how U.S. and China should cooperate together regarding these climate issues, and like people like you, how you value these climate issues.
Yeah.
Why are those issues so important?
Well, I think those are very important questions, and so, for example, one of the things that we consider seriously here at Harvard is that we think that our undergraduates should have the opportunity to spend time overseas in places like China. And so we work pretty hard to find ways to give them the opportunity to spend like a summer, for example, in Beijing. And that's a very, very important thing, because the young people come back here, they graduate, and by and large, Harvard undergraduates, when they graduate, become influential people in society. I mean, the fact is that this is a university that is producing very smart people, essentially. Okay, well, if we can produce smart people who also have a sensitivity to global issues, that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I also hear about, like, some people say that Chinese government help a lot of companies to do all those rare earth materials processing, and that's the cause about why Beijing is now so polluted.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I think it is true. It's true that the form of government is different in China compared to the U.S. And so the government has, in principle, more power. The central government has more power. They can make a decision that, okay, we're going to invest in solar panels, and we're going to do that in a major way, and we're going to invest money and incentives in different parts of the country to develop those solar panels, and they can do that. But I mean, the problem with that is that if it gets to the point where it's not economic, then you start having to close down factories, and if you're closing down factories, what do you do with the people who are losing their jobs? And so I think that's a current situation problem in China that China is working to deal with.
Yeah, but do you think that's kind of danger for the world? One day, if the central government has more power, and one day Xi Jinping changes his mind, and he decides to go another way, a totally different path to deal with climate change issues. Do you think that would be danger?
I think that the Chinese government has been remarkably successful since 1978. And how were they so successful? They were successful because the leaders decided that China could not be isolated. China had to be part of the world. And getting access to the World Trade Organization was an important part of that. And building trade relationships with different countries was an important part of that. And I think that the worry would be that if the Chinese economy goes seriously negative, does the government lose power? And do people then decide that they can change things? But the government has a lot of power, and it's very difficult for the people in China to put real pressure on the government. But one of the things that struck me as interesting was that a few years ago, 2024, there was blackouts in China. The blackouts there was a shortage of electricity in serious parts of China, and so the lights went out, and it was a hot weather, and the government was under pressure. The people said, "Look, what are you doing?" And And part of the government response to that was to say, okay, maybe we were too soon and too quick to cut down on using coal. So maybe we need to continue to build more coal-fired power plants as well as investing in wind and solar. And so they made that decision to do that because of the pressure from the people who, you know, the fact that these blackouts were very serious things.
So I actually see that a powerful central government is a plus
Yeah.
for dealing with those serious issues.
Yeah, it is, but and then the flip side of that is to people who would argue that that people need a level of freedom
Yes.
to be able to think outside the box, to be creative, and that authoritarian governments tend to stop that, and you know, that's the other side of the coin.
Yeah. So, but what's your personal view about this question? This is my personal question.
Okay.
I'm really curious about.
I think that there's a danger, and we have to have our eyes wide open to the danger. And I think that what is happening in a number of parts around the world is a cause for concern. I mean, that you have sort of fascist governments, extreme right-wing governments taking over in different parts of the world, and that's dangerous, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Wow, it's 4:30 already.
Okay.
Wow.
So where are you off to
Fast.
now?